the vast, man expanse of the Arizona desert, there lies the place that most people have never heard of. A town that, if mentioned, only stirs confusion or uneasy silence among the locals. A town that was never marked on maps, never celebrated in history books. It was known as Shadewood, a small settlement nestled deep in the unforgiving sands. Once, it was a thriving community, alive with chatter, bustling markets, and the hum of daily life. But then, something changed. Something sinister took root, and Shadewood was erased from existence, swallowed by the desert and the sands of time. In the beginning, Shadewood was no different from any other small town in Arizona. The sun beat relentlessly down on the dirt streets, and the people lived simple lives. The town was made up of a few dozen homes, a general store, a small schoolhouse, and a saloon where the men gathered after a long day of work. It wasn't much, but for the folks who lived there, it was everything. The community was close-knit, and everyone knew each other by name. They worked hard, played hard, and found comfort in the predictability of their routines. But as the years passed, things started to change. At first, it was subtle. Small things that no one thought too much about. People spoke of hearing strange noises at night, whispers carried by the wind, or the sounds of footsteps that didn't seem to belong to anyone. No one could explain it, but it wasn't enough to make anyone nervous. The desert was a place full of strange sounds, after all. Animals scurrying through the brush, the wind howling through the dunes. It was all part of living in such a desolate place. However, things began to escalate. People started noticing that certain areas of the town felt off. The weather, too, seemed to grow more unpredictable. The sun would beat down with unbearable intensity, and then, without warning, the sky would darken, as if a storm was on the horizon, only for the clouds to dissipate without a trace. The strange, unsettling occurrences grew more frequent, but it wasn't until the disappearances started that the true horror of Shadewood began to unfold. At first, it was one person, an elderly woman named Martha Jennings, who lived alone on the outskirts of town. She had always been a bit reclusive, so when she went missing, it was written off as her simply wandering off, or perhaps passing away in solitude. But then, other disappearances followed. The local sheriff, a man by the name of George Matthews, was the first to take notice. He wasn't one to believe in rumors, but the situation was becoming hard to ignore. It started with the disappearance of Martha, then the sudden absence of James Roberts, the blacksmith. James had been known for his quick wit and hearty laugh, but when his shop was found empty, there was no sign of him. His tools were left scattered across the floor, a single iron horseshoe half finished on the anvil. As days passed, more people vanished, men and women, children and the elderly, each of them leaving behind no trace, as if they had never existed at all. By the time the fifth person disappeared, the town was in full panic. Sheriff Matthews organized search parties, scouring the desert, looking for any sign of the missing townsfolk. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie stillness that seemed to settle over the town. The people of Shadewood began to whisper among themselves, their voices trembling with fear. Some said it was a curse, an ancient evil that had been awakened by something long buried beneath the sands. Others spoke in hushed tones of a creature, something monstrous, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. The town began to divide. People started locking their doors at night, refusing to let anyone in or out. Parents kept their children inside, afraid that the next knock on the door would be the last one. Friends and neighbors grew suspicious of each other, and fear took root deep within the hearts of those who remained. The once thriving community began to crumble under the weight of its own terror. But it wasn't just the disappearances that haunted Shadewood. There were the whispers, soft, urgent voices that seemed to come from nowhere. They would drift on the wind at night, barely audible, but unmistakable to those who listened closely. The whispers would grow louder and louder until they filled the entire town, chilling the bones of anyone who dared to stay awake. Some claimed to hear their names being called, while others said they heard their loved ones' voices, beckoning them to come closer. But no one dared to follow the sound, not after what happened to the ones who had gone before. As the days turned to weeks and then to months, the situation grew worse. It wasn't just the missing people anymore, it was the atmosphere itself. The town felt heavy, as if the very air was charged with something dark and malevolent. The land seemed to grow more hostile, the sun blindingly bright during the day and unbearably cold at night. Animals began to flee the area, and even the hardiest of plants withered and died under the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. Then, it happened. One fateful night, after the sun had set and the last vestiges of light had faded into the horizon, a screaming tore through the silence. It echoed through the empty streets, so raw and desperate that it could be heard for miles. Those who heard it said it was the scream of a woman, high-pitched and full of terror, cut short by a bone-chilling silence. The scream didn't belong to anyone they knew, but they couldn't shake the feeling that it was a warning. The next morning, the town was empty. There was no sign of the people who had lived there just the day before. No bodies, no blood. It was as if they had simply evaporated, leaving nothing behind but the cracked earth and the empty buildings. Even the sheriff was gone, leaving behind only his badge and the faint scent of fear in the air. Over the next few years, people came to look for Shadewood, but no one ever found it. The land had swallowed it whole. The town swallowed by the endless dunes, its existence erased as if it had never been there. The road that led to Shadewood faded into nothing, and those who dared to seek it out never returned. It was as if the town had been forgotten, a footnote in history that no one cared to remember. And yet, there are those who still say the town is out there somewhere in the desert, hidden beneath the sands. They say if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the whispers, carried on the wind from a time long past. Some claim to have seen the shadows of the missing townsfolk, wandering the ruins of Shadewood, forever trapped in the nightmare that had started so long ago. Perhaps it is better to leave Shadewood forgotten, to let its secrets die with it. Because once you know the... It was the summer of 1923 when things in Shadewood started to change. At first, it was subtle, something that crept into the town slowly, like the heat of the desert settling in. Shadewood had always been a place where the heat lingered well into the evening, with the sun casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth. But that particular night, something felt different. The desert air, usually thick with the scent of dust and sagebrush, felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was as though the entire town had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. People began to notice strange things happening in the dead of night. At first, it was just whispers, soft voices carried by the wind, whispers that seemed to follow the townspeople wherever they went. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to reach out to them. But when they turned to look, there was no one there. And then came the screams. The first one was heard by Martha Jennings, an elderly woman who lived alone at the edge of town. She was the first to tell anyone about it, but they dismissed it as just the wind or some animal in distress. But the scream was human, a sound of terror that sliced through the quiet night. The next few nights were even worse. People reported hearing more screams, always distant, but so loud and chilling that they couldn't ignore them. It wasn't just the screams, though. It was the shadows. People began seeing figures darting across the corners of their vision. Figures that would vanish the moment they turned their heads. At first, they thought it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But then, the feeling of being watched settled over everyone like a dark cloud. It wasn't just the shadows or the sounds. It was the overwhelming sense that something was wrong in a way that couldn't be explained. It wasn't long before people started talking about it, and when they did, the whispers grew louder. They spoke of a curse, something that had been buried beneath the town for years, something ancient and evil. Some of the older folk talked about the stories they had heard as children, stories about a dark presence in the desert, a malevolent force that had taken root in the land long before Shadewood had been founded. But those stories were just that, stories, told around campfires to scare children, or so they thought. As the days passed, the town grew more and more uneasy. The farmers had begun to notice something odd about their livestock. The cattle were acting strange, their eyes wide with fear, their tails twitching nervously. Some of the horses had even bolted from their stables in the middle of the night, refusing to go near the edge of town, where the dunes stretched endlessly. The people who owned the horses swore they could hear something out in the desert, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. The wind carried it back to the town, but no one could identify what it was. The fear reached its peak when the local sheriff, George Matthews,
attempted to leave Shadewood for a routine checkup at a neighboring town. He had heard about the strange occurrences, but he wasn't one to be easily frightened. He saddled up his horse and made his way out of town. But just as he reached the outskirts, his horse suddenly reared up, throwing him to the ground. The animal wouldn't move, no matter how much he tugged on the reins. It was as though something had gripped the animal, freezing it in place. Sheriff Matthews tried to push forward, but his horse refused to take another step. He finally had to walk back into town, frustrated and baffled, his face pale from the experience. He couldn't explain it, but there was no denying the fear in the horse's eyes. It was the same fear that had begun to spread among the townspeople. By now, no one felt safe. People started staying indoors after dark, locking their doors and windows. Those who ventured out after the sun went down reported feeling as though they were being followed. The feeling of eyes on their backs, the unmistakable sensation of being hunted, crept into the hearts of the bravest men and women. And then came the worst part. People started to disappear. It started with James Roberts, the local blacksmith. He had been working late one night, hammering away in his shop, when his wife noticed the lights flicker. When she went to check on him, the shop was empty. His tools were scattered across the floor, a horseshoe halfway forged. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no sign that he had left willingly. His wife called out for him, but there was no response. The authorities were notified, and a search party was formed, but nothing was ever found. James Roberts had vanished into thin air. The next person to go missing was Rebecca Adams, a young school teacher who had been known for her kindness and warmth. She had been out for a walk in the evening, something she did often to unwind after a long day. But that night, she didn't return. Her footprints were found in the sand, leading away from the town, but they stopped abruptly in the middle of the desert. There was no trace of her after that. No signs of a struggle, just empty footprints that disappeared into the night. The disappearance of Rebecca was the final straw for many of the townspeople. Something was wrong, and they could all feel it. Sheriff Matthews had already lost a few good men who had gone looking for the missing townsfolk, never to return. In desperation, a small group of people decided to take matters into their own hands. Led by Samuel Green, a local farmer and one of the town's most trusted men, they decided to venture out into the desert to find the answers. They had no real plan, just a growing sense that they needed to understand what was happening. If they didn't, they feared it would continue until no one was left. Samuel, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by the sun, had heard the whispers too. He knew the desert well, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. As he gathered his group, he noticed the fear in their eyes. They weren't just afraid of the desert. The group set off in the early hours of the morning, before the sun could rise high enough to scorch them. They rode their horses, their faces shielded by scarves and wide-brimmed hats, and traveled into the desert, their horses' hooves kicking up the dust. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of leather, or the soft nicker of a horse. They rode for hours, each man lost in his own thoughts, but the unease in the air was palpable. And then they found it. Off in the distance, there was something that none of them could explain. Abandoned homes. At first, they thought they were just mirages, but as they got closer, they realized that the buildings were real. It was a ghost town, long forgotten. The homes were decayed, their windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. They were surrounded by an eerie silence, as if no one had lived there in years. But as they explored the area, they found something even more disturbing. Bloodstains on the floorboards of one house, as though someone had been dragged across the room. And in the sand outside, the footprints. But these weren't ordinary footprints. They were large, unnatural prints, like something much bigger than a human had walked there. Following the trail, they made their way to the edge of the town, where the footprints led to a cave. It was hidden among the rocks, its mouth dark and foreboding. Samuel Green, his heart pounding in his chest, stepped forward, leading the group into the cave. What they found inside would change everything. The cave seemed to swallow them whole as they entered, its darkness so complete that even the smallest sliver of light from their lanterns barely made a dent. The air inside was cold, thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. The ground beneath their boots was uneven, the walls jagged and rough. As they moved further into the cave, their footsteps echoed off the stone, the sound of their breathing becoming unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. Samuel Green led the way, his face tense, eyes darting from one shadow to the next, trying to make sense of the strange feeling that was slowly creeping up his spine. It was more than just fear. It was a primal sense of danger, a warning from deep inside him that something was terribly wrong. The rest of the group followed closely, each man and woman holding their breath as they ventured deeper into the cave. It wasn't long before they came upon the first signs that something horrifying had occurred in this place. At first, it was just a few discarded items, belongings strewn across the floor, half buried in the dirt, old clothes, boots, a broken lantern. But then they saw the bodies. A first body was sprawled out in front of them, twisted in a way that made Samuel's stomach turn. It was a man, his limbs bent at unnatural angles, his face contorted into an expression of sheer agony. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. But it was the other details that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. The body had signs of torture, deep cuts and bruises that looked too precise, too deliberate to be the result of any ordinary injury. The skin was mottled with what appeared to be burns, and there were strange, dark marks on his neck, as if something had been wrapped around it tightly. It was clear that this man hadn't just died. He had suffered. The others stood frozen for a moment, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. Samuel, unable to tear his gaze away from the sight before him, could feel the sweat forming on the back of his neck. He wanted to look away, but the horror seemed to draw him in, pulling him deeper into the cave, towards something darker, something more disturbing. They moved further into the cave,
And it didn't take long for them to find more bodies, more victims of whatever had transpired here. Each body was worse than the last. Some were barely recognizable, their features twisted beyond recognition. One body had been torn apart, its limbs separated from its torso, as if some kind of monstrous force had ripped it apart. Another had been pinned to the wall by what looked like crude iron spikes, its body hanging limp, blood long since dried. The bodies were scattered throughout the cave, left in various states of mutilation, their final moments of life written in the macabre scene that greeted the group. The air grew colder as they continued deeper, and Samuel's skin prickled with a sense of dread that only intensified the further they went. It wasn't just the bodies, it was something else, something in the cave itself, something watching them from the shadows. And then, as they moved further into the heart of the cave, they found it, the symbol. It was carved into the stone wall, an intricate, unsettling design that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. The symbol was ancient, its lines jagged and uneven, but unmistakably deliberate. It looked almost like a sigil, something old, something powerful. Samuel felt a wave of unease wash over him as he stared at it. The feeling that this was no ordinary mark, growing stronger with every passing second. There was a strange energy about the symbol, as if it was alive, pulsing with some kind of dark force. The group gathered around it, their eyes drawn to the image, but none of them spoke. What could they say? They didn't know what it meant, but they all felt it. This symbol, this mark on the wall, was connected to whatever had happened here. It was the source of the darkness that had taken root in the cave. The thing that had caused the pain and suffering of the people who had once called this place home. Samuel took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this symbol wasn't just a warning. It was a curse, a mark that had been placed here for a reason. But what that reason was, he couldn't even begin to guess. As the group stood in front of the symbol, the air grew even colder, and an oppressive silence filled the cave. Samuel's breath came in shallow gasps as he felt something stir behind him, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the shadows shifting and flickering in the weak light of their lanterns. Still, the feeling lingered. Something was watching them. He felt the need to leave, to turn around and run back to the safety of Shadewood, but something held him in place. It wasn't just the mystery of the symbol or the bodies scattered around them. It was something deeper, something that was waiting, something that was just beyond the edge of their understanding. And then the whispers began. At first, it was faint, barely audible above the sound of their breathing. Soft, almost imperceptible, like the wind whispering through cracks in the walls. But as Samuel listened, he realized with a start that the whispers weren't coming from outside the cave. They were coming from within, from the very stones themselves. He could hear them clearly now, soft, persistent voices that seemed to call his name, Samuel. The voice was faint, but it was there. It was calling him, and the more he listened, the clearer it became. It was a woman's voice, trembling with fear, but it was unmistakably his name that was being whispered over and over again. Samuel. He turned, his eyes wide with terror. But there was no one there. The group had heard it too. He could see it in their faces. The same look of confusion and fear that mirrored his own. They had heard the voice, but they didn't know where it had come from. There was no explanation, no reason for it. It was just there.
"Did you hear that?" one of the men, John Harris, asked, his voice shaking.
"I heard it,"
Samuel whispered, his throat tight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then, without warning, the cave began to shake. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but soon it grew stronger, shaking the very walls of the cave. The ground beneath their feet trembled, sending loose rocks and debris falling from the ceiling. Samuel reached out to steady himself against the wall, but the tremors only grew worse, and the air grew thick with dust. "We need to get out of here," Samuel shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the deafening roar of the cave. But as they turned to leave, something happened. The cave entrance, the way they had come, was gone. The sandstorm, which had seemed like a distant threat just moments before, had appeared out of nowhere, its winds howling and swirling, trapping them inside.
The storm hit with a fury that none of them had anticipated. Sand filled the cave, clogging their lungs and blinding them. The whispers grew louder. Now, a maddening cacophony of voices, all calling to them, all urging them to stay. The cave had become alive with an ancient force that refused to let them leave. Trapped, suffocating in the dark, Samuel and the group realized with a chilling certainty that whatever had been lurking in the shadows of Shadewood was real, and it was not going to let them escape. When morning finally came, the storm that had trapped them in the cave for what felt like an eternity cleared with an eerie calm. The winds that had whipped around them with maddening force suddenly stopped, leaving nothing but a haunting silence. As the dust settled and the air grew still, Samuel Green and the others stumbled out of the cave, but as they emerged into the light, it was clear. Their eyes, once sharp and full of life, were now hollow, dull pits of despair. Their faces were ashen, drained of all color, their skin a ghostly pale that seemed unnatural against the backdrop of the bright desert sun. Their movements were slow and stiff, like puppets whose strings had been tangled, and as they tried to speak, only incoherent mutterings escaped their lips. The words they tried to form seemed foreign to them, as though their very minds had been shattered by the horrors they'd witnessed. Their hands shook uncontrollably, and their bodies trembled as if they had come into contact with a force so dark, so powerful that it had stripped away their humanity. It wasn't just Samuel and his group. The others who had stayed behind in Shadewood began to notice the strange behavior. The survivors of the cave returned with vacant stares, their eyes glazed over, like they were seeing something far beyond the dusty roads and decaying buildings of the town. They couldn't explain what had happened in the cave. No one could. They couldn't even remember much about the time they had spent in the cave. All they knew was that, whatever it was, it had changed them. It had taken something from them that they could never get back. As days passed, a sense of dread settled over Shadewood like a thick fog. People began to whisper among themselves,
exchanging stories about the survivors' behavior. Some of the survivors had started to act violently. John Harris, one of the men who had ventured into the cave, became particularly aggressive. He would lash out at anyone who came too close, shouting nonsensical phrases, his voice raw and guttural. It wasn't like the man they had known. Something was wrong. Something had taken hold of him. It wasn't just John. Others began to display similar signs of aggression. They would stare at their fellow townspeople with eyes full of rage, and occasionally, someone would disappear into the night, never to be seen again. But when the survivors spoke, they said nothing about what had happened in the cave, as if they were too frightened or perhaps too confused to even remember the horrors they had faced. The air in Shadewood grew thick with paranoia. Everyone had always known each other in the small, close-knit community. But now, it was as though they couldn't trust the people they had once called friends. The very sight of the survivors filled the town with a sickening sense of unease. Those who still had their sanity tried to keep their distance, avoiding eye contact and keeping their conversations to a whisper. Even the children, once carefree and full of life, had stopped playing in the streets. They could feel it too, the dark, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to everything and everyone. It wasn't long before people began to disappear once again. The survivors were not the only ones who were vanishing. But these disappearances were different. It wasn't just the elderly or the travelers who would often wander through Shadewood. It was people the townspeople had known for years. People like Sarah Duncan, the schoolteacher, and Eli Matthews, the sheriff's brother, had disappeared without a trace. This time, there were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing. The town was slowly emptying out, piece by piece, and nobody knew where they were going, or if they were going anywhere at all. In the dead of night, when the moon was high and the desert air was thick with heat, the massacre came. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a storm on the horizon. But by the time the first scream rang out, it was already too late. The survivors, those who had come back from the cave, returned that night, but they were not the people they had been when they first left. They were something else entirely. They had become vessels for the malevolent force that had corrupted their minds, a darkness that had seeped into their souls and twisted them into something unnatural. They moved through the town like shadows, their bodies unnaturally stiff, their eyes burning with a crazed hunger. And then the bloodshed began. It was brutal. There was no warning, no mercy. The survivors, those possessed by the evil of the cave, didn't just kill, they savored it. They tore through the town like a storm, ripping into anyone who crossed their path. The first victim was Eli Matthews, the sheriff's brother. He had been trying to barricade himself in his home, but the door was kicked open with a force that shattered the wood into splinters. Eli barely had time to scream
before he was dragged out into the street, his cries for help swallowed by the night. The others followed, each victim falling to the relentless onslaught of violence. No one was spared. Man, woman, or child. It didn't matter who they were or how old they were. The survivors showed no mercy. The town was a slaughterhouse.
The violence was chaotic, unrestrained. There were no words exchanged, only the sickening sounds of blows landing and screams filling the air. It was as though the survivors were not in control of their own bodies, as though something far darker was guiding their hands, pushing them to destroy everything in their path. It was as though they had become puppets, controlled by the dark force that had been unleashed in the cave. The massacre continued through the night, the streets running red with blood. The town that had once been full of life was now a graveyard. Buildings were set on fire, their windows shattered, and the remains of the townspeople were left where they had fallen. There was no attempt to bury them, no attempt to honor their memory. They were simply abandoned, their bodies becoming part of the destruction. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the town was silent. The sounds of screams and chaos had stopped, replaced by the eerie quiet that seemed to hang in the air. The survivors had disappeared again, their bloodied footprints the only trace of their presence. No one dared to go near the town after that, for fear of what had become of it. Shadewood, once a thriving community in the desert, was now nothing but ruins, nothing but a ghost town where the echoes of violence still lingered in the air. The bodies of the fallen townspeople were left behind, scattered across the streets and inside their homes, where they had once lived in peace. There was no one left to mourn them, no one left to remember them. The town of Shadewood had been consumed by darkness, swallowed whole by whatever evil had been unleashed from the cave. The massacre had left nothing but destruction and madness in its wake. And the survivors, those who had returned from the cave, had become something else entirely. They had become the harbingers of death, the embodiment of the terror that had taken root in Shadewood, and now they were gone, leaving the town to rot and decay, forgotten by the world. But the truth of what had happened in Shadewood would not be forgotten. It would linger in the wind, carried by the desert sands, and anyone who dared to seek it out would find that some horrors are never truly gone. They live on, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon them, to become part of the darkness. When the authorities finally arrived in Shadewood, there was nothing left but the remnants of destruction. The once thriving town, which had been a place full of life, had been reduced to nothing but a smoldering ruin. The buildings were little more than charred skeletons, their wooden frames blackened and broken. Ashes hung in the air, swirling with the wind, the remnants of what had once been a community. The streets were eerily silent, with no children playing or people walking down the dusty roads. The signs of life had been erased, just like the people who had lived there. There was no sign of the bodies, no trace of the victims who had been slaughtered during the massacre. The blood that had soaked into the earth the night before had vanished,
as if it had been swallowed by the land itself. The only evidence of what had happened were the bloodstains that marred the floors of the abandoned homes, the broken furniture left scattered, and the lingering sense of something terribly wrong in the air. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. When the first search parties arrived, they found nothing but more signs of the horrific events that had taken place. The streets were empty, devoid of life, as if Shadewood had been abandoned overnight. The townspeople who had survived the massacre were nowhere to be found. There were no tracks, no signs of escape. It was as if they had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the ruins of the town. Some of the searchers believed the survivors had fled into the desert, but there was no way to track them. The desert was vast, endless, and unforgiving. Those who ventured out to search for the missing townspeople soon found themselves caught in a strange and unnerving fate. Some never returned at all. They were swallowed up by the desert, their bodies never found, as if they had simply been consumed by the earth. Others came back, but they were never the same. The horrors they had witnessed in Shadewood had broken something deep inside them. And when they returned, they were not the people they had been before. They muttered incoherently, their minds fractured by the terror they had encountered. Their eyes... In the years that followed, Shadewood was slowly forgotten by the world. The authorities abandoned any attempts to investigate further, and the ghost town was removed from official records, as if it had never existed at all. But there were whispers that refused to die. People who lived near the outskirts of the desert spoke of strange occurrences. At night, when the wind howled through the empty landscape, some said they could still hear the distant screams of the townspeople. Others claimed they had seen figures moving in the shadows, ghostly shapes drifting in the sand. Travelers who ventured too close to the area reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something unseen was watching them, waiting for them to come closer. It was as though the town's dark history had left a mark on the land itself, a curse that lingered in the air. Some tried to find the ruins of Shadewood, driven by curiosity or the hope of uncovering the truth. They would follow old maps, long-forgotten routes, hoping to stumble upon the lost town. But those who ventured too far into the desert rarely returned. The ones who did return spoke of the unnatural stillness they had encountered, the silence that pressed in on them from all sides. Some claimed they saw the remains of the town, crumbling, half-buried structures that seemed to rise out of the sand as if they had never truly been erased. Others said they could feel the presence of something sinister lingering there, something that had been left behind in the wake of the massacre. It was as though the land itself held the memories of what had happened, preserving the horror in ways that were beyond understanding. For many years, the ruins of Shadewood remained a mystery. People would come and go, but the town's secrets never seemed to be fully revealed. It became a place spoken of only in hushed tones, a place that was best avoided, left undisturbed
by those who feared what might still be lurking there. It was as if the desert had claimed Shadewood, swallowing it whole, and then decided to keep its secrets. But some say that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the cries of the lost souls of Shadewood, their voices carried by the wind, faint but unmistakable. The screams of the innocent who had died in the massacre, the souls of those who had been consumed by the evil that had taken root in the town. And if you are brave or foolish enough to venture into the desert, you might just find the ruins of Shadewood yourself. But be warned, the land has a way of keeping its hold on those who dare to uncover its secrets. Some say that the town is still there, hidden beneath the sand, waiting for the next curious soul to come searching for the truth. And those who do venture into the dunes might find more than they bargained for. The curse of Shadewood is not something that can be easily escaped, and the horrors that once plagued the town may still be waiting for someone else to stumble upon the dark truth that lies buried in the desert. Shadewood may have been forgotten by the world, but the desert has a way of keeping its memories alive. The town's story lives on in the whispers carried by the wind, in the restless spirits that wander the empty streets, and in the warnings passed down by those who still remember. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are some things that should never be forgotten. Some places, some horrors that should remain buried, left to rot in the sands where they belong. But as time goes on,
the legend of Shadewood persists,
growing in whispers, waiting for the next person to seek it out, to uncover the truth that lies beneath the ruins, in the cursed land where the screams still echo in the night. To this day, no one truly knows what happened in Shadewood, and perhaps it's for the best that it remains shrouded in mystery. The few who dared to uncover its dark past were either never heard from again, or returned forever changed, broken by the horrors they encountered. Even the most hardened of investigators could find no answers, only more questions. Some say it was the work of demons, ancient evil forces unleashed by greed, by meddling where they had no right to. Others claim it was a curse tied to the land itself, a malignant force that had lain dormant beneath the sand for centuries, waiting for the right time to strike. But whatever the cause, one thing is certain. The Arizona massacre that destroyed Shadewood was not something easily forgotten. The screams of its people, the echoes of violence that once shattered the peace of that small desert town, cannot be erased. The memories of the horrific events have seeped into the very soil of the desert, haunting those who are brave or foolish enough to venture near the cursed land. Some claim that the curse of Shadewood still lingers, buried beneath the sands, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its terrible secret. The massacre itself was horrific enough to be seared into the minds of anyone who had heard of it. The brutal slaughter, the eerie disappearances, the twisted bodies left behind in the aftermath. Each image was more grotesque than the last, and no one dared to speak of it for long. The survivors,
Those who had walked away from the nightmare were haunted for the rest of their lives. Their faces bore the marks of the curse, their eyes hollowed out by the things they had seen, their souls forever scarred by the darkness that had consumed Shadewood.
And yet, as much as the town and its people were erased from history, some still remember. Some still seek answers, unable to let go of the mystery that surrounds Shadewood. The town may have been abandoned, but its legacy lives on in whispers. People speak of it in hushed tones, telling stories to scare the next generation, warning them to stay away from the desert. But these warnings often fall on deaf ears. Young and daring adventurers, eager to make a name for themselves or to solve the riddle of Shadewood, continue to search for the truth. They venture into the desolate land, drawn by the pull of the legend, by the lure of uncovering something that was meant to remain buried.
And as they disappear one by one, it becomes clear that whatever happened to Shadewood, whatever force was unleashed there, has not been laid to rest. The curse is not something that can be forgotten, nor is it something that can be easily escaped. The desert does not forget, and neither does the nightmare that lives in the sands. There are those who say they've seen the ruins of Shadewood, though it's always in the most unlikely of places, hidden deep within the desert, shrouded in mist, or rising out of the earth at dusk, when the sun is low and the shadows stretch long across the land. Some who claim to have found the remains of the town say it's as if time itself had stopped there, frozen in place like a photograph. The buildings are still standing, though they are decayed and half buried in sand. The streets are eerily silent, except for the howling wind. There are no signs of life, and yet there's something there, something waiting. Those who venture close enough to investigate say they feel it, the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that does not want to be found. For the brave souls who have dared to explore Shadewood's ruins, the price of their curiosity is high. They've reported seeing figures moving in the distance, shadows that seem to disappear when you try to look directly at them. The air grows thick with dread, and a sense of unease settles over everything. It's as though the land itself is alive, watching, waiting, as if it has not yet finished what it started all those years ago. Some have even claimed to hear whispers, soft voices, carried on the wind, calling them deeper into the ruins. But those who hear the whispers rarely return. They vanish into the desert, leaving behind only their belongings, their maps, their equipment, never seen again. Even those who haven't ventured out to Shadewood's ruins can feel its presence. The cursed sands of Arizona continue to claim those who search for the truth, pulling them into the heart of the mystery, where the nightmare never truly ends. The stories persist, passed down through generations, each telling more haunting than the last. The curse of Shadewood cannot be forgotten, because it is a part of the land now, part of the desert itself. It waits, hidden beneath the surface, for the next foolhardy soul to come too close, to disturb the dark secret that lies buried.
The people of the surrounding areas know better than to seek out Shadewood. They've heard the stories about the town that was swallowed by darkness, about the evil that once lived there. Some of them still remember the old-timers who used to speak of the town, of the things they had seen in their youth, and of the warnings they gave. But as time passed and the town faded from memory, fewer and fewer people believed the tales. It became a distant legend, just another story to tell around a campfire. But the land remembers, and the land does not forget. It's said that if you are truly brave, or perhaps just foolish, you might hear the screams of Shadewood's former inhabitants carried by the wind on the quietest nights. On nights when the desert is still, when the air is thick with heat, and the stars hang low in the sky, those who listen closely enough can hear the echoes of the past, the screams, the cries for help, the sound of something twisted and evil moving in the darkness. It's not just a ghost story. It's a warning. Because once you've heard it, once you've felt it in the very air around you, there's no turning back. The curse has marked you, and like the others before you, you'll never truly escape it. Some people believe the nightmare of Shadewood is over, that the evil that consumed the town has passed on, but they are wrong. It lives on in the desert, in the sands that shift and change, erasing all evidence of the town, yet preserving its curse. It waits for those who venture too far, those who push too hard to uncover what was never meant to be known. The price for curiosity is steep, and for those who seek the truth of Shadewood, it is a price that might be too high to pay. For those who listen to the warnings and turn away, the nightmare remains just a story, a legend. But for those who seek it out, for those who dare to venture into the cursed sands of Arizona, the nightmare is not over. It is only just beginning.